How common is it for individuals to experience wage theft, and does it vary by industry?
Yeah, so wage theft happens a lot. Part of the problem is we don't really know how often it happens, and that has to do with why it's happening. Um, you know, Wage theft occurs in a lot of different forms, and we can get into all that. But sort of fundamentally, a lot of the times it's happening and workers don't know about it, or they don't have a paper trail to allow them to document it, which means that we, the researchers who try to investigate this question, have a hard time really measuring how often it happens. I can say that when researchers have attempted to look at this, what they have found, and I published a study on this topic a number of years ago. We looked at just workers who appeared to be getting paid less than the minimum wage, and in that particular form of wage theft, we found that in the 10 most populous states in the country, uh, workers were paid. This was happening to about 7% of low wage workers in some states, 5% of workers in others. So it's happening a lot more frequently than folks realize, but it's really hard to understand how often it's happening.
And so that difficulty in terms of documenting it, I assume that's to the benefit of corporations because they can obviously engage in this practice because there's just not much to show that it exists.
Yeah, I mean that's part of it. I mean, we just to put some numbers on it, we estimated that if the trends that we were observing in these 10 states were similar across the entire country, that would mean that low-wage workers were losing over $15 billion a year taken out of their paychecks. And when we did this study, this was back in 2015, the data that we were looking at. Today, if you simply adjusted that amount for inflation, we'd be talking about over $20 billion a year that's being captured by employers that workers are legally entitled to.
And I hear you note that low wage workers are seem to be the majority of these cases. Why exactly are low wage workers the target of wage theft?
Well, it's not just low wage workers who are victims of wage theft. And the type of wage theft that we've been able to analyze, as I mentioned, is people not being paid the minimum wage that they're entitled to. And so that sort of, by definition, is looking at who among the lowest paid workers in our economy are suffering this wage theft. But it can happen to higher paid workers. For instance, if someone is a higher paid worker and works more than 40 hours in a week, but doesn't receive overtime, that's wage theft. If someone is a an hourly worker who's making more than minimum wage, might have a decent pay rate, but they're asked to do something extra after they've already clocked out. That would be wage theft. If their employer is taking deductions from their paycheck that they haven't authorized, they haven't agreed to, that's another form of wage theft. So there's lots of different forms that it can take, and it doesn't only happen to low wage workers, although it does disproportionately happen to low wage workers because these are folks who, generally speaking, have the least bargaining power in the labor market, and so they may not feel empowered or may not have the resources to really speak up if their employer is not treating them fairly.
To expand on the idea of bargaining power for a bit, we've seen that union membership has really declined over the past few decades. What impact has that had on the prevalency of wage theft?
Yeah, well, having a union is one of the best ways to hold employers accountable. And a lot of unions even do what's called co-enforcement. It's when they sort of look after and make sure that the employer is doing everything that they're supposed to be doing by their employees. And when you are a member of a union, you have mechanisms, you have systems in place to help you raise a grievance to take up an issue with your employer if you feel you've been mistreated in a way. And there are legal obligations that the employer has in those instances to work with the union to resolve whatever the issue is, whether it's a potential wage theft situation or something else. So that decline in unionization has meant that there's just far fewer workers who have that extra protection that a union offers to prevent wage theft from happening. And it's not just the fact that that there's fewer unionized workers who they themselves are getting that extra protection, but the fact that there is less union presence in the economy overall means that more employers probably feel like they can engage in wage theft a little bit more easily because there's fewer options out there for a worker to go and find another job that's going to be protected by a union.
What are some of the policy solutions that states have approached the issue of wage theft with?
Yeah, so I mean the biggest thing is one, just making sure that workers have recourse within their states. So a lot of states don't even have any sort of enforcement body in the state to tackle wage theft if a worker suffers a violation. In many of those states, the state agencies, the relevant state agencies, just defer that enforcement capacity to the federal government. So if you're, for instance, a worker in Florida who's fallen victim to wage theft, your only recourse is to go to the federal wage and hour division to try and get your employer to do what's right. So the first thing is just making sure that the state has an enforcement body to help folks. The second thing that can be done is, some states have better pay transparency laws than others, and by that I mean there are states today where your employers are not even required to provide a pay stub, and that's really tough. If you've fallen victim to wage theft, but your employer's not providing you any documentation to show that, then it's really hard to try and pursue a claim, whether through an enforcement body like a state agency, or to file a lawsuit, for instance, if you wanted to try and pursue legal action that way. So the second thing is just make sure that there's good wage payment laws on the books requiring that employers provide pay stubs that clearly show the hours worked, the rate of pay, any deductions that were made, those sorts of things, to make sure that workers always know what their employers are doing in terms of paying them and have a paper trail in the event that something bad happens. And then the last thing that I would recommend is that, we talked about unions. States can take actions to make sure that workers in their states are able to join and form unions more easily. And as we talked about, when a worker has access to a union, they have someone who's there prepared to step in and fight for them if they're falling victim to any sort of bad behavior by an employer. And so making it easier for workers to form and join those unions is one thing that states can do also to prevent this.
Would you say that the rise in right to work legislation in some state legislatures is a concern when it comes to union membership in the future?
Oh, for sure. I mean, right to work, intentionally misleadingly named policy. It does nothing about providing a right to work to anyone. All it does is make it harder to form and maintain unions. And the growth in right to work laws over the second half of the 20th century is one of the primary things that has driven the decline in unionization across the states. So getting rid of those laws is one of the best things that state lawmakers can do in order to empower workers to have a stronger voice on the job. And fortunately, we had a state just recently, Michigan, a few years ago, overturn. It was the first state in decades to overturn their right to work law, and now Michigan is a union state again.
I do want to just expand a little bit more on the economic implications because we have seen that, of course, when it's disproportionately lower income workers, that does kind of take money out of the economy that could be disposable income to spend. Do we have any insight into just the overall economic implications when people have less money in their pocket?
Well, certainly when there's less money for people to spend, that slows down growth. And low wage workers are more likely than higher wage workers to spend every single dollar that they receive because they have to in order to make ends meet. And so when you're reducing the amount of money that those folks have, it does have a depressing effect on consumer demand, and that's not good for the economy overall. We obviously want the economy to grow, and the biggest source of growth in the U.S. economy is consumer spending. So employers capturing or stealing some of that money and maybe giving it back to shareholders, or retaining it for CEOs who are probably going to save a portion of that money as opposed to spending it, that's not good for the long-term growth of the economy.
Well, David Cooper, director of the Economic Analysis and Research Network, I appreciate you joining me.
Thanks for having me.